Hello, everyone. My name is Corbin Irwin. I'm here as a part of CYB 515, talking today about remote workplace policies. Some of our objectives today: we're going to identify security failures in relation to remote workplaces, describe the CIA triad and how it applies to the identified failures, and then identify security principles, design principles, and how they relate to the failures as well. We're also going to recommend some design principles that apply to remote work and how we can improve upon it. So what is the CIA triad? We have three components: the confidentiality, integrity, and availability. Confidentiality is simply, is this data secure? Is our system secure? Are people able to access them? Is it confidential? That's important. Integrity, what is the value of our data? Are we sure it's not been modified? Is it staying the same way it was when it was sent? Is this data of good integrity? And then availability, are our systems up? Can people utilize our systems? Do we have good information when we need it? Are we able to get to our systems on demand? Important considerations. So let's talk about some of the common security failures. We've identified a couple here: weak passwords, unsecure home network connections, phishing, unencrypted file sharing, unsecured home devices, ignoring physical security, security controls are weaker, and use of unauthorized third-party tools. We're going to dive into each one of these a little bit more in depth on our next slides. So let's talk about weak passwords. Why are we concerned with this? Well, from the confidentiality standpoint, this allows people to get access to our systems. It lets them to exploit our systems, get to files, maybe to other systems. From an integrity standpoint, they can modify our files once they have access to them. Availability, they might be able to take systems offline. Definitely not what we want. So, what design principles were violated? Open design. Open design is basically saying that the security shouldn't come from obscurity. So just because you have a design that no one knows about, say for example you have a password no one knows about, doesn't mean it's secure. In this case, a weak password that doesn't have a lot of different characters is easier for someone to crack. Even though they don't know it, it doesn't make it secure, so that violates that principle. Then reluctancy to trust. In this principle, basically you're saying you should always assume the environment is insecure. So you should be worried that someone is trying to hack your password. So again, kind of back to the obscurity, yeah, maybe no one wants to get your password, you think. Well, if they did, is it hard for them to do? So you should always assume someone's trying to hack you or attack you. Reluctancy to trust principle. So unsecure home network connection. Let's talk a little bit about that. Confidentiality is broken in an unsecure home network because it allows hackers to intercept information, maybe on your side or maybe from the company side, and they can use that information to break confidentiality. They can also do a man-in-the-middle attack and affect integrity of files and change information being sent back and forth. And then availability. If your network is unsecure, they may be able to take you offline. So what design principles were violated? Well, least common mechanism is one. This principle states that if a resource is used by an object, it shouldn't be shared. So in this example, the home network, if it's open, it's likely it could be shared. You don't want that. You don't want to share this resource. You want it secure. And then reluctancy of trust. You need to assume that the network is going to be attacked and make it as secure as possible. So you should never trust that your network is just safe, because it's not. So you should do more to secure that network before you connect. Phishing, very common that we see this, especially with remote work. People are trying to gain access to people's systems, networks, get their own information so they can attack that way. How does this affect us? Well, confidentiality. Again, they're getting access to our files, to our systems, to our accounts. Integrity, if they get access to those accounts, what can they change? They can modify files, get on other servers, change things there. They can impersonate you. Availability, they can lock you out of your account once they've gained access. So they're able to completely keep you out of your own account. You have no availability. Those are all things that we consider within the CIA triad. Design principles that are violated. What are we ignoring when things like this happen? Well, reluctancy to trust. Again, assuming that everything is an attack. We need to completely look at these emails, make sure they're safe, make sure they're from the right sources, and then complete mediation. Is there a way that we on the company end can set up a better control for what people are able to download from the emails? Should we be filtering emails more carefully? Complete mediation basically states that we should completely mediate access to all files, that it shouldn't be allowed, that everything should have a control. Another big one that we need to consider is unencrypted file sharing. So a lot of companies will have encryption when they share files between users. But when you're at home, what solution are you using? Sometimes it's unencrypted, sometimes it's not secure. So the confidentiality with the system is not good. You know, when you're sharing those files, it exposes them to the internet, with file servers that are maybe a third party, and to other users or attackers. The integrity can't be confirmed as easily either. If it's unencrypted, it could be modified where an encrypted file would not be able to be. Availability, if we're not using encryption, again, it could be a hack. They could take down those files. They also might be able to see what those files are and target them more easily and bring them offline if they wanted to. So what principles were violated when you did this? Not encrypting the files allows others to easily access it. The fail-safe principle states that default access to a file should be none. So fail-safe says that if there's an object, by default, you should have no access to it. So it's not encrypted, other people have access. Violates this principle. Complete mediation. By not encrypting the file, the principle is violated. File access should be mediated. There should be a control put in place. Reluctancy to trust, again. You should always assume someone is trying to intercept your files and encrypt them. So let's talk about unsecured home devices. In a world of the Internet of Things, smart devices, and other considerations like those, there's a lot to talk about here. Devices that are connected to the home network that are not digitally or physically secured can be open doors for hackers. They can break your confidentiality within your network. Your integrity of your files, your systems, such as if you're using USB drives or hard drives, if it's not physically secured or they're digitally secured, they can modify your files and break the integrity. And availability, if they're able to actually physically steal your devices, that's a consideration too. You won't have the availability. Again, reluctancy to trust is what we see here. We see that connecting devices to the network that might be unsecure is unsafe. You should always assume that they are hacking points or attack points. And then least common mechanism. Again, we've talked about that a little bit. Least common mechanism states that you shouldn't be sharing a resource. So if you have smart devices, maybe have them on a separate network than your work connection is. Ignoring physical security. This is a concern we see a lot because you never know where you're going to be working when you're doing remote work. Sometimes there are controls, but sometimes there aren't. So how is your actual workspace safe? When we consider this with the CIA triad, confidentiality, we think about things like, are we able to see your screen? Are you able to steal your device? Integrity, is someone able to get on your system in hours you aren't using it and modify your files? Availability, are people able to take your computer away from you, steal it, and remove your availability? So what design principles can we use here? Open design. This is violated when people think that they're safe just because of who they are. They're not important. They're not a company. Well, they still could be a target of an attacker. And then complete mediation. There should be controls as to where people can connect, how they're able to connect. Maybe they can only connect at home, only during certain hours. If you mediate this completely, you're able to control a little bit more of the circumstances. In general, one of the big concerns is weaker security controls at home. Weak security controls, such as what we've talked about, completely blow away the confidentiality principle. You have to have good security controls. Integrity, when we don't have proper security controls in place, which most companies are creating the policies on the go with this big push to remote work, you have bad integrity. You don't know how valid a file might be. And availability, without proper security controls, connected VPNs and other different mechanisms, people might not be able to connect. They won't be able to actually utilize the security services you have. So what do we violate when we have weak security controls? Well, the design principle of isolation, that systems should be isolating programs and protecting data for work-related tasks, which often doesn't happen on a home computer. Reluctancy to trust, again, you're not assuming that all of the environments are unsafe. You don't have the time maybe to go through and see all of the different problems someone could have within their home network, and we're violating that principle as well. Now let's talk about the use of unauthorized third-party tools. As many people started working from home, not all companies had the tools that they needed for communication. And this led people to use third-party tools. Confidentiality was a huge concern when this happened because third-party tools often had terms and services that were different. We didn't know what information they were looking at and what information they were using. So that's something to consider within the CIA triad. Integrity. Once again, we have to consider that maybe people were able to modify files that were sent on these services. Are we sure that the files are being sent the same way? We don't really have control over how the files are being sent, so that's something to consider. Availability. These services don't work on your time. They could be down for large periods of time, and if you have files and conversations hosted on them, you could lose access to those. That's another thing to consider. So what design principles were violated? Well, least privilege. Least privilege says that only the minimum amount of access and rights should be given to a service or user to complete a task, and only for a minimum amount of time. That relates to our terms and services. Often these apps required more access than they really needed to do what we wanted to accomplish. So we're giving them more permissions than what we would like to. And then least astonishment. This principle states that an app or a system or a program should behave how we expect, and often third-party apps do not. They had many different behaviors that we didn't know, and this made them insecure. So what are some design principles that I think are important for remote work? Reluctancy to trust, least privilege, and least common mechanism. Let's talk about those a little more. Reluctancy to trust. Users and admins should always assume that remote connections are at risk of being exploited. Always. Users should always assume that they could be subjected to an attack and actively avoid it. What are you doing to prevent this from happening, assuming it's going to? Admins should always assume that users' local connections are more susceptible for attacks and take steps to mitigate the risk. So don't trust the circumstances people are in. Make sure you are actively seeking ways to make things more secure. Least privilege. Control how users access company files. Especially when environments might become more secure, access controls might need to be minimized. Control what systems they have and if they can modify files. Control when users can access the system, maybe only during working hours. That way, if the computer is shared, less problems. Minimize the effect and time of exposures in case of attack. So minimize by controls and minimizing time that they have access to the system, you're able to minimize the effects if an attack were to happen. You're mitigating. And then minimize risk from purposeful attacks or mistakes made by users. So again, controlling any access can help minimize the effects of an attack. So least common mechanism. This is saying that you don't want to share resources. So let's consider, for example, ensuring that a user has a company PC and isn't just using their own personal system. This helps ensure that resources aren't shared between their personal life and their business life. It can remove a lot of conflicts. Ensure that connections are made through VPNs with encryption and not sharing the same unencrypted channels as other machines, making sure that the network is secure and then using an encrypted VPN to actually do work. It's a good way to limit shared resources. And then limit access to your own company systems by known IP addresses and only allow access at home instead of at coffee shops and other locations with open networks. Make sure that they're not going somewhere else where the network might be shared and they're only accessing it from home. These are all great ways to utilize this principle to protect yourself. That concludes our discussion of remote work and design principles and how they apply. These are our references. Thank you so much for your time, and I hope you have a wonderful day.